Hello, and welcome back for this scientific ethics lecture where we're going to take a look at some of the ethical issues around the costs of prescription drugs. So in the last set of lectures, we talked a little bit about clinical studies, primarily how it relates to the development of new drugs, and with the idea that we want to come up with, better medications for, the treatments of disease and kind of the prevention of, debilitating conditions. But it's a long, relatively drawn out process that's fairly expensive from the start to the finish. So if we take a look at this, what we've got on this diagram is a view of kind of new drug development. And so we're looking at kind of the top up here. A pharmaceutical company or group of scientists are going to start looking at kind of the biological properties, the potentially medical properties associated with interesting compounds, and they're going to test lots and lots of kind of related compounds in an effort to find something that is interesting for a clinical setting, something that could potentially be used to treat a disease or improve the health of an individual or group of individuals primarily. And so what we're looking at kind of at the start of that process is anywhere from about 5,000 to 10,000 components or compounds that we're interested in studying. And as we go through the discovery phase, do that preclinical animal research and maybe tissue culture research kind of along the way, a lot of research going on, we're going to whittle down that 5,000 to 10,000 compounds into, about 250 that look really interesting. We're going to test those on cells, we're going to test those on animals. And from those 250 compounds that, we're going to be testing in some way, we may get 5 of them that are potentially interesting that we're going to pursue as we go into the clinical trials. And again, keep in mind that what we're talking about with the clinical trials, you got the phase 1 trials where we're going to test it out on healthy volunteers to make sure it's safe to treat them. Going into the phase 2 trials where, we're going to take a look at, kind of ensuring, still studying to make sure it's safe, but potentially using this to see if it improves the condition of the individuals that are taking it, and ideally improves it better than the existing medications out there. Ultimately, as we go through this whole process all the way down here to kind of this new drug, which is going to be developed, out of those 5,000 to 10,000 compounds that are interesting that we're going to be, putting into the start of this process, we may get one FDA approved drug. And that's assuming that everything works well along the way. We could be investing all of this time, a lot of money in terms of the kind of research costs, supporting kind of all the scientists, supporting the volunteers that are, being tested within the clinical studies. We're looking at billions upon billions of dollars that's being invested in this process, and anywhere from 10 to 15 or 20 years to the point where we can get a new drug being approved here. And so it's an incredibly long process, an incredibly expensive process, but it's something we still want to pursue because we want to come up with better compounds, better drugs that we're going to be using. And so what we're looking at is that the US government and other governments around the world are going to be providing a little bit of protection for these companies that are developing new drugs. And what they're going to be doing is issuing a patent. A patent is going to provide the manufacturer, the company that's investing all of this money and all this time into the discovery of a new drug, into a lot of time, a lot of money. They need to be able to recoup what they've got, what they've invested into it in some way. And so with this patent protection, you're basically looking at the company that kind of creates the new drug. They're normally going to get about 20 years of protection. This 20 years is going to start before the clinical trials start, because you can go on to the clinical trials site at the clinicaltrials.gov to take a look at US clinical trials and get an idea of what people are investigating, kind of get a jump start on that process. So ultimately, by the time it gets through and gets into the point where it's approved by the FDA and the company can actually sell it as a prescription drug, they're going to have about 7 to 12 years of protection. And the hope is that during that 7 to 12 years, they're going to be able to recoup the money that they invested in it, as well as generate additional funds so that the company can continue to work and continue to develop new drugs along the way. But as you can see, if you're going to be investing billions upon billions of dollars to get one drug kind of down here at the bottom, when you're within your patent protection period, you want to make sure that you're going to be, recouping those funds. So you have to be able to sell the drug at a price that is accessible to the public, but is also going to allow you to, recoup what you've invested into this process. Now, if we take a look at it, innovator drugs are what is abbreviated, or the way that people within the industry talk about the first drug of a kind that becomes available. And so that's going to be the branded drug. And so that's going to be the drug that is produced by the company that's doing all of the research. It's going to be protected by the patent. And the hope is that if this drug goes to market, if it's approved by the FDA and doctors can prescribe it, they're going to be able to come up with the $800 million, almost $1 billion that they're investing in the production of the drug during that period of time within patent protection. And so if we take a look at it, the FDA, as we said, is going to be giving exclusive marketing rights to the groups that are doing the research and are manufacturing a new drug. And as we saw, again, going back 2 slides, the patent protection is normally going to be about, well, it's 20 years, but by the time it goes to market, it could be anywhere from about 7 to 12 years. But there are times when it's not going to be possible to, fully recoup the benefits. And the reason for that is that there are other kind of criteria, other exclusivity lengths of time that the FDA looks at. And so, the orphan drugs, so drugs for different diseases that I don't want to say as popular, but as prevalent within society. New chemicals have additional information that's in there that can add on to that period. Other exclusivity clauses, pediatric exclusivity, so that would add 6 months on to the existing patent exclusivity pattern. And so that the FDA can give you a little bit more time to attempt to get your money back if you're a pharmaceutical company. But ultimately, as we've seen, especially within the last year, but it's been very prevalent over the last probably 10 or 20 years, lots of concerns about the costs associated with prescription medications, to the point where, there are a lot of arguments that prescription medication should be a lot cheaper because people are having difficulty, paying for their medication and treating their disease. And in some cases, they're not taking their medication as prescribed because they can't afford it. And that's not a good situation. And so what we're looking at is many pharmaceutical companies are looking at almost an idea of recycling. Basically taking drugs that have already been developed, already been approved at some level, and attempting to discover new uses. And so what we've seen is that there are many different medications that are now available that can be used in a variety of settings, used to treat a variety of diseases. And so what we look at, if we're going to be kind of recycling an old drug, or basically coming up with a new use for an old drug, you don't have to go through all of that kind of preclinical research. You don't have to do all of that work. You don't have to do some of the safety testing that would need to be done, because it's already been shown to be safe. But what you need to do is go into your phase 2 clinical trials and be able to show that this drug is going to be effective for the treatment of a new disease. And so you're basically using it for a different purpose than it was originally approved for. And so a good example of this is thalidomide. For those of you that haven't heard about thalidomide, I encourage you to kind of research it just a little bit. Thalidomide was approved in the late 1950s for use as a sedative to help people sleep. And what happened during that period of time in the late 50s and early 60s is that expectant mothers, women that were pregnant, were having a difficult time sleeping And so they would take thalidomide to help them sleep, and again, to try to stay healthy. But it was very apparent very quickly that thalidomide, when given to expectant mothers, causes very severe birth defects in the newborn infant, to the point where you can see that the arms aren't developing. So you've got a hand up here with a very short arm bone structure. So you have no developed arm up here. You got a little bit of a leg developed here, but it's primarily foot. And so you've got these very severe birth defects where it's interfered with the normal development of the embryo. And so because of that, thalidomide was pulled from the market very, very quickly. Lots of lawsuits, lots of problems associated with it. I think 2020 has a good, the news show 2020, and it's 2020 now. So, okay, so the news show 2020 had a good investigative journal report on thalidomide. And so basically this has been used as an example of something that's been approved, but it wasn't tested effectively or as extensively on pregnant women, and therefore they missed out on these birth defects that have very, very severe effects. But more recently, drug companies have gone back to thalidomide and discovered that it actually is a very effective treatment for multiple myelomas. Multiple myelomas are a form of cancer. And so basically, it can be used to treat cancer, but it can't be used for women that are pregnant or women that could potentially become pregnant. And so in many cases, if a doctor is going to prescribe thalidomide to treat multiple myeloma in a woman of childbearing age, they're often required to go on some form of birth control to minimize the risk that they would become pregnant, and we would see these birth defects occurring. So again, this is recycling or new uses for an old drug. But ultimately, and again, if you're like most people, we're interested in the generic drugs. The generic drugs or generic firms basically don't go through all of the research and development to come up with new drugs. What they look at is an attempt to come up with a generic version of the drug. And basically, it's going to be a version of that prescription drug that is similar, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, similar but not exactly identical to the prescription drug. And if they're doing that, they can get a copyright protection, copycat protection, so they can have 6 months of exclusivity of producing the generic. And so, if you go to a pharmacy, you can see Tylenol as a pain reliever, as a brand name, and then you can see lots of other companies producing I can't think of the name of Tylenol off the top of my head, but I think it's acetaminophen. So basically, you can get either the Tylenol as a brand name or a generic brand, which has the same biological effects. So if we take a look at the generic drugs and try to figure out what all this means in the relationship of prescription drugs and drug development, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration basically looks at a generic drug as being identical or biologically equivalent to a brand name drug. So basically, it's going to have the same effects as a brand name drug, but it doesn't have all of the expenses built into it that require a brand name drug and the company that developed it to charge a higher price. And so what we can see is that brand name drugs tend to be very, very expensive, where generics are much cheaper. And so an example of this is the cholesterol lowering medication that we've got here. Zocor is the prescription or the brand name for this cholesterol lowering medication. And it estimates at about $138 per month retail. But Simvastatin is a generic version of this cholesterol drug. And instead of $138 a month, Simvastatin is going to be about $32 a month. So, under a quarter of the overall cost. And so when we take a look at this, these generic companies are able to produce and distribute these generic drugs because they haven't put as much investment into it. So they only have to show that, again, as we talked about the definition up here, that their generic drug is biologically equivalent to the name brand drug. So they don't have to go through all that original research and testing. All they have to do is, kind of abbreviated form of testing to show that it's biologically equivalent, and it's, essentially the same from a treatment perspective as the brand name drug. And they once they have the generic developed, once they have the research that shows it's equivalent, they will put in an abbreviated new drug application and get that approved. And so if we take a look at this, and again, my family uses a lot of generic medication because of the cost associated with it. But generics are estimated to save patients anywhere from about $8 to $10 billion a year. So it's a huge industry when we take a look at it. Now, keep in mind that generic drugs are not exactly identical to the brand drugs. So what we're looking at is they're going to be cheaper, they're going to be biologically equivalent, and so they're going to have the same active ingredient. But the other ingredients may be a little bit different. And so if you, go to the drugstore, you go to the pharmacy, take a look at it, you're going to see that, the biological active ingredient, they're going to describe what it is, but there are going to be a whole lot of other things that are used in packaging the medication and, putting the, slow release into it, and putting it in the capsule and all of those things. And so they're equivalent from a biological standpoint, but they are different. If you go through and your doctor prescribes you a new medication, you may not be able to get a generic, again, because if we go back into this process, that the company that developed the drug in the first place invested lots of time, lots of money in creating it, may have a patent. So they may have exclusive rights to produce and distribute the drug for a period of time. But I can guarantee you that, if it's a drug that's popular, there are going to be generic companies out there working to develop a generic drug so that as soon as it becomes available, that patent expires, they're going to be producing these generic medications for you. Now, what I've described is kind of the US system. And so take a little bit of a step aside and take a look at other systems as well. And so we've got our neighbors to the north, Canada. And so what we see is that they've established a patented medicine prices review board, basically a government board that kind of looks at the costs of prescription drugs with the goal of being that the companies need to, sell the drug, they need to be able to, get an income, they need to be able to kind of recoup their benefits, their investments, if you want to think about it that way. But they shouldn't be price gouging. They shouldn't be, because we have these exclusive rights, we're going to jack up the price and make lots and lots of money at the expense of patients. And so the Canadian Government Board basically says that existing drugs can't increase faster than the rate of inflation. And so basically once a drug is out on the market, it can't, the prices can't go up astronomically and skyrocket in that way. New drugs cannot cost more than similar drugs for the same illness. And so basically it means that if you're coming up with a new drug for an illness, even though it may be better, even though you may have invested, some money and some time into the production of that drug and the approval of that drug, it's still going to be priced at about the same as similar drugs. And if you come up with something completely new, a new class of drug, it can't cost more than a median price for the drug in other countries. And so basically they look at, what is this drug selling for kind of around the world, and saying we're going to have kind of this average price, which is going to be present, the median price, which is going to be kind of associated with the drug when we take a look at Canada. And so because of that, prescription drugs in Canada tend to be much less expensive than they are within the United States. Again, lead right into the next slide. So drug prices in Canada are cheaper in the United States. So we've got the government price control. So this patented medicine prices review board in place there. They're putting caps on the costs of the medication. They also have a government healthcare plan within Canada, which allows them to kind of purchase the medications in bulk. And because they purchase them in bulk, they're able to get a fairly sizable discount as opposed to in the United States, where each individual pharmacy is going to be purchasing the drug from a wholesaler. The wholesaler is going to be purchasing it from the company. You know, the price is going to get marked up every step along the way. And in general, within the United States, they're purchasing small volumes of the drugs. So you're not going to be able to get that bulk discount being present. Addition, if we take a look at the legal system in Canada versus the legal system in the United States, they still have malpractice laws. They still have the ability of people that have been harmed by the treatment of their disease to, go to court and try to seek a resolution in that way. But in Canada, they have limits and lowered the liability so that they don't have to worry about huge jury awards being presented to the people that bring in the lawsuits. And so examples of this, if we take a look at this, Lantus in United States is about $490 a month. Lantus in Canada is about 93, so under a fifth of it. Humalog, which I think is an insulin analogy, an insulin drug for treating diabetes, $675 a month within the United States, but it's only 56 within Canada. And again, both of these are going to be insulin analogs for treatment of diabetes. I should have looked at the bottom where I could have seen kind of insulin for all down here. So again, we see this huge discrepancy in the prices between the United States and Canada. The United States, if we take a look at it again in relationship to the rest of the world, the United States is the only industrialized country with no price controls on patented medicines. Basically, the drug companies, the pharmaceutical companies have very strong lobbying efforts that have basically convinced our government that they need to be able to price the drugs at a way that allows their company to survive, and that any effort at price controls is going to prevent them from reinvesting in their company, reinvesting in the development of new drugs. Patient advocates, kind of on the opposite side, are making a pretty strong argument, and this is something that a lot of people are debating, that the government research and the National Institutes of Health, which support kind of most of the biomedical research that occurs within colleges and universities in the United States, the National Institute of Health support a lot of the research that's that early preclinical research that's used in drug development. And so patient advocates are saying that the government's already investing in this. You don't have to, the pharmaceutical company doesn't have to recoup everything. They just have to recoup the money that they're putting into it. And so it's not as expensive as the pharmaceutical companies are claiming it is. If we take a look at recent surveys, and again, this one's from 2017 from the Kaiser Family Foundation, basically saying that most of the public is in favor of keeping the costs of prescription drugs down in some way. And again, this is a variety of questions related to that, but basically pointing out that there's a lot of concern about the cost of medication within the United States. If we take a look at it kind of down here at the bottom, basically encouraging people to buy a lower cost drug like a generic, requiring them to pay a higher share if they choose a similar high cost drug. And so basically saying, and a lot of insurance policies are like this right now, your prescription plans. Your prescription plan will only cover a portion of it if you go for the brand, but if you go for the generic, they'll cover a much greater proportion, or in many cases, they'll waive the copay if you're using a generic as opposed to a brand name drug. And so again, there's a lot of efforts out there in an effort to keep the cost of prescription drugs down. There are other ideas associated with it. The idea that we should be able to purchase drugs from outside of the country. We see this kind of in the pre-internet days with people driving across the border into Canada or driving down into Mexico in an effort to buy drugs down there. And I'm talking prescription drugs as opposed to other types of drugs, but medications that would be prescribed by a physician. There's a lot of concern associated with it. The FDA claims that if you're purchasing these drugs from out of the country, you don't have as much information about quality assurance. There's potential that you're going to be purchasing counterfeit drugs. So, companies, making something that looks like the drug that you think you're buying, but it's not. And if you're taking a drug that's not going to give you the same biological effect, you run the risk of making your condition much worse. And so because of that, the FDA really kind of locks down the ability to purchase drugs, purchase medications from other locations other than these approved suppliers within the United States. Now, in an effort to kind of get drugs to the market, we talked a little bit about this last time when we're talking about clinical studies and kind of approval, is that there are kind of accelerated approval processes. And so for very serious life-threatening illnesses without existing satisfactory treatments, there are methods in which we can get drugs to the market quicker. And so we saw this in the late 80s and early 90s, and continuing now with many HIV drugs, with AIDS. They're able to get it to market relatively quickly, but then there's the expectation that they're going to continue to study the drug in those later clinical trials and provide that information. And again, if that information makes it look like the drug isn't having the effect or potentially could be causing a difficulty for the patients that are taking it, the FDA can withdraw approval. And so, we've seen a couple of examples of that even recently this year. And then finally, the FDA Office of Orphan Product Development. This is where the U.S. is going to be providing incentives to companies to develop products for rare diseases. And the way they're defining a rare disease is it affects a relatively small number of people within the United States. So I think, currently there's about 193 million people within the United States. So you're looking at an orphan disease, an orphan drug that we're going to be looking at is only going to affect, less than 200,000. And so, if we, do the math real quickly, that's, 1/1000th of the population. So it's just a very, very small percentage of the population. And so if a company develops a drug for the treatment of one of these diseases, it's going to be unlikely that they're going to be able to recover the cost for that new drug development. Because, you're in the situation, if you're going to produce a painkiller that you're going to market to 193 million or, half that number, 100 million people, you can make it up in volume, make a little bit of income on, each little pill, and make lots and lots of money. But if there's only, 100,000 people buying it, it becomes much more expensive. And so the FDA Office of Orphan Product Development provides these incentives so that the company doesn't have to get all of their money back from the patients that would be purchasing the diseases. And that's been a pretty good strategy. From 1973 to 1983, there were only about 10 orphan drugs developed in the, and do the math real quickly, 35 years that I have data from this. We see about 600 drugs since this program was put in 1983. So that finishes up kind of our overview of the cost of prescription drugs, a couple different ideas about things that we should be thinking about with prescription drugs. I got a couple articles here for you to take a look at. Understanding the U.S. commercial pharmaceutical supply chain. This is by the Kaiser Foundation that did one of the surveys, looking at patient and public concern about prescription drug costs. Financial Times article about why prescription drugs cost so much in the United States, as well as a Forbes article from 2019, taking a look at drug prices are rising, even though there's a lot of political pressure to try to keep them in place. So take a look at those. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you and have a great day.